I remember temperature. The first thing they taught me was that flesh responds to cold differently than to heat, and that the difference matters when you are learning to unmake a body from the inside. The preparation chambers beneath Master Zerethis' laboratorium maintained precisely 17 degrees, cold enough to slow bleeding, warm enough to keep nerve endings responsive. I learned this on my third day as his apprentice. I learned it by experiencing it for 6 hours while he removed sections of my epidermis to demonstrate flaying techniques. My name was Calithax. I was 147 years old when I became an apprentice, which in Camorra meant I was still considered young, still possessed of the arrogance that youth carries even among the Drukhari. I had served in a Kabalatai warrior squad for 30 years, had participated in 17 real space raids, had killed efficiently and taken prisoners for the arenas. I believed I understood pain. I believed I understood cruelty. I believed these things because I had inflicted both, and witnessed both and thought myself numbed to them. I understood nothing. The Haemonculi do not recruit apprentices through traditional means. They do not advertise, do not seek out candidates, do not offer contracts or terms. They simply observe. Somewhere in Camorraga's endless depths, a Haemonculus watches the arenas, the fighting pits, the torture galleries. He watches for specific qualities, not strength or skill with weapons, but something else. A particular kind of curiosity. A willingness to study suffering rather than simply inflict it. An interest in the mechanics of pain rather than merely its application. Master Zerethis had been watching me for 6 years before I knew he existed. I first encountered him after an arena match where I had been assigned to execute a captured Imperial Guardsman. Standard procedure: draw out the death, make it entertaining for the crowds, extract maximum suffering from minimum time. I had performed adequately according to the arena masters, but afterward, as I cleaned my blades in the preparation chambers, an ancient Drukhari appeared beside me. I had not heard him approach. He simply materialized from the shadows. His form extensively modified, extra limbs folded against his torso, his face restructured into something that was no longer quite humanoid. His eyes replaced with crystalline sensors that refracted light in patterns that hurt to observe. "You hesitated during the execution," he said. His voice emerged from a voxcoder grafted into his throat, bypassing whatever remained of his original vocal apparatus. 3 times. Once when you severed the radial nerve, once when you began the abdominal incision, once when you applied the pain amplifiers to the cervical vertebrae. I did not ask how he knew. I asked why it mattered. "Because you hesitated not from mercy, but from curiosity," Zerethis said. "You wanted to observe the physiological response before proceeding. You were studying, not simply executing. This suggests potential." He offered me apprenticeship. The terms were simple. I would serve him for a minimum of 3 centuries. During this time, I would learn the arts of flesh crafting, pain cultivation, biological modification, and the 1,000 techniques that separate a Haemonculus from a common torturer. I would learn through direct experience. Every technique he taught me would first be performed on me, so that I would understand completely what I was creating in others. I would be vivisected, modified, reconstructed, and unmade hundreds of times. The process would be agonizing beyond anything I had experienced. If I survived and mastered the knowledge, I would become a Haemonculus myself. If I failed, I would become raw materials for his laboratorium. I accepted immediately. This is what we are, we Drukhari. We do not fear suffering. We simply seek to ensure we are the ones inflicting it. The laboratorium existed in Camorraga's lower depths, accessible through passages that twisted through the webway's architecture in ways that defied standard 3-dimensional navigation. The chamber itself was vast, approximately 400 meters across, with ceiling heights that varied from 3 meters to 20 depending on the section. The walls were lined with specimen tanks, each containing examples of Zerethis' work, living things, or things that had once been living, suspended in alchemical solutions. Some screamed silently against the glass. Others had been modified past the point where screaming was possible. The center of the laboratorium contained the surgical tables, 17 of them arranged in a circular pattern around a central platform where Zarathus conducted his primary work. Each table was equipped with restraint systems, monitoring equipment, tool arrays, and drainage channels for the fluids that would inevitably flow. The entire facility smelled of chemical preservatives, recycled air, and something organic that I could not identify. Flesh, perhaps, or bone marrow, or the particular scent that living tissue produces when being systematically disassembled. Zarathus had 4 other apprentices when I arrived. He did not introduce them. He simply gestured towards them as we entered the laboratorium, identifying them by function rather than name. 3rd-year apprentice, 5th-year apprentice, 9th-year apprentice, 23rd-year apprentice. They did not acknowledge me. They were occupied with their current lessons. The 3rd-year apprentice was strapped to one of the surgical tables, while Zarathus's senior assistant, a grotesque thing that had once been Drukhari but was now mostly artificial systems and cultured tissue, methodically removed his lungs and replaced them with enhanced respiratory organs grown from his own cells. The apprentice was conscious throughout. The procedure required consciousness. You cannot learn proper lung function if you are not aware of each breath. The 5th-year apprentice was practicing nerve splicing on a captured human subject. Her hands shook slightly. Zarathus observed this and made a note on a data tablet grafted into his forearm. The 9th-year apprentice was being prepared for cardiovascular modification. His chest cavity had been opened, his ribs spread by mechanical retractors. His heart continued beating, visible and exposed, while Zarathus's assistants prepared the enhanced organ that would replace it. The 23rd-year apprentice stood at a surgical table performing advanced modifications on a subject whose species I could not identify. His movements were precise, efficient, utterly without hesitation. He had the look of someone who had forgotten what it meant to fear the work. Zarathus gestured for me to approach the empty table nearest the laboratorium's entrance. "Your education begins with understanding," he said. "You cannot craft flesh until you understand how flesh functions. You cannot cultivate pain until you understand its mechanisms. You cannot modify a body until you have experienced modification. Remove your armor and restraints. Lie down on the table. We will begin with something simple." I complied. The table's surface was cold against my back. The restraints closed automatically. Not crude chains, but sophisticated binding fields that held me immobile without applying pressure that might damage the tissue Zarathus intended to work with. Lesson 1. Zarathus said, positioning himself beside the table. His additional limbs unfolded, each tipped with different surgical implements. The nervous system, standard Drukhari physiology, includes approximately 783 million nerve endings distributed throughout the body. Each responds to specific stimuli. Each transmits signals at measurable speeds. Each can be manipulated to produce precise sensations. We will map your complete nerve network over the next 6 days. This requires exposing each nerve cluster, testing its response parameters, and documenting the results. You will remain conscious throughout. Anesthesia would compromise the data. He began at my left hand, making an incision along the radial nerve pathway. I had been injured in combat many times. I understood pain as a warrior understands it, sharp, immediate, manageable through training and willpower. This was different. Zarathus was not simply cutting. He was exposing nerve bundles with microscopic precision, then applying measured stimuli directly to the exposed tissue. Electric current, chemical irritants, temperature variations, pressure. Each stimulus produced a different quality of pain, each carefully documented by the monitoring equipment grafted into the table itself. The process continued for 6 days, exactly as Zarathus had stated. He worked with meticulous care, never rushing, never making errors. He mapped every nerve pathway in my body, exposing tissue, testing responses, recording data. He worked in shifts of approximately 14 hours, then left me on the table while he attended to his other apprentices or his various contracts. During these periods, I remained restrained, my exposed nerves carefully preserved in alchemical solutions that prevented degradation but did nothing to reduce sensation. On the second day, he mapped the intercostal nerves between my ribs. On the third day, the femoral and sciatic nerve networks in my legs. On the fourth day, the trigeminal nerve complex in my face. On the fifth day, the spinal column. On the sixth day, the nerve endings in my genitalia, my eyes, and the soles of my feet. When the mapping was complete, he closed the incisions using biological adhesives and regenerative compounds that accelerated healing without scarring. Within 4 hours, my skin had sealed completely. Within 8 hours, the pain had reduced to manageable levels. Within 12 hours, I could move without discomfort. The data has been archived, Zerethus said. Your nerve map will serve as your baseline. Every modification we perform will be measured against this standard. Now you understand how nerves function when intact. Next, you will learn how they function when damaged, severed, and reconnected. The following lesson began immediately. Over the next 3 months, Zerethus systematically damaged and repaired my nervous system 17 times. He severed nerve bundles and reconnected them in different patterns. He transplanted nerve tissue from one location to another. He grafted foreign nerve fibers into my existing networks. He chemically altered nerve sensitivity, increasing and decreasing pain response thresholds. He damaged nerves through crushing, burning, freezing, and chemical dissolution, then taught me the techniques for repair while demonstrating them on my own body. Each procedure was performed with me as the subject first, then immediately afterward. I would perform the same procedure on a provided subject, usually captured humans or lesser species that Zerethus acquired through his various contracts. The pattern was invariable. Experience the technique, then replicate it. Learn through suffering, then teach through inflicting. I learned nerve splicing while having my brachial plexus severed and reconnected 4 different ways. I learned pain amplification techniques while experiencing them applied to my own spinal cord. I learned nerve blocking procedures while having sections of my sensory network systematically shut down and reactivated. Each lesson came with complete understanding because I had felt every aspect of what I was learning. By the end of the 3rd month, I could perform basic nerve manipulation with adequate precision. Zerethus evaluated my work on a captured Imperial Guard officer and determined my technique was acceptable but lacked refinement. He assigned me supplementary practice, 6 additional subjects, each requiring complete nerve mapping and modification. I worked continuously for 11 days to complete the assignment. The 6th-year apprentice reviewed my work and reported that 2 of the subjects had been damaged beyond recovery due to my imprecise cutting. Zerethus accepted this as normal learning curve variance. The subjects were processed into raw biological materials for the laboratorium's growth tanks. The cardiovascular system came next. This lesson required more extensive preparation because modifications to the heart and blood vessels carried higher risk of mortality. Zerethus did not want me dead. Dead apprentices could not learn, and he had already invested 3 months in my education. He began by replacing my blood with synthetic circulation fluid that would maintain tissue oxygenation even if my heart stopped functioning. Then he stopped my heart. I remained conscious while he worked. The synthetic circulation fluid kept my brain functional, but the sensation of cardiac arrest was unlike anything I had experienced. Not pain exactly, but wrongness. The fundamental awareness that a critical system had failed and my body was dying even though death was being artificially prevented. Zerethus removed my heart completely, holding it in one modified hand while his other limbs continued circulating my blood through external pumps. He showed it to me, the muscle still twitching reflexively, though disconnected from my body. Standard Drukhari cardiovascular organ, he said, as if lecturing. Approximately 320 grams. 4 chambers, capable of circulating 6.3 liters of blood at 117 beats per minute at rest. Adequate for baseline function but significantly limited compared to optimized designs. He placed my original heart in a preservation tank. then spent the next 8 hours constructing a replacement using cloned tissue from my own cells, genetically modified for enhanced performance. The new heart had additional chambers, reinforced muscle tissue, integrated chemical regulators that would allow me to consciously control my circulation rate and blood pressure. It was, objectively, superior to my original organ in every measurable way. Installing it required reconnecting 17 major blood vessels and 34 minor ones, integrating the new organ with my existing nervous system, and calibrating the chemical regulators to respond to my conscious control. Zarathis performed the installation while explaining each step. I observed through my own consciousness while he literally rebuilt my cardiovascular system. The new heart activated without complications. Blood flow resumed. The external pumps were disconnected. I felt the new organ begin beating, faster and stronger than my original heart, its rhythm strange and unfamiliar. Zarathis monitored the integration for 47 minutes, then declared the procedure successful. "Now you understand cardiovascular modification through direct experience," he said. "Next, you will perform the same procedure on yourself under my supervision." I initially misunderstood. I thought he meant I would practice on provided subjects. He clarified immediately. "You will remove your new heart, construct a replacement using improved techniques, and install it yourself. This will teach you precision and self-control. If you damage critical vessels during the removal, you will die. If you make errors during the installation, you will die. This is how you learn to work without error." He provided me with the surgical tools, activated the external circulation systems, and stepped back to observe. I performed my first self-directed cardiovascular modification over the course of 11 hours. My hands trembled during the critical vessel connections. Zarathis observed the trembling but did not intervene. When I finished, the new heart, my third heart in 10 days, functioned adequately. Zarathis evaluated my work and gave me a performance score of 62%, acceptable, but requiring significant improvement. I performed the procedure 6 more times over the following month, each time removing my current heart and replacing it with a newly constructed one. By the 7th iteration, my hands no longer trembled. By the 7th iteration, my performance score reached 91%. By the 7th iteration, I had stopped thinking of the organ in my chest as my heart and began thinking of it as the current cardiovascular component. This was the beginning of a fundamental shift in my consciousness. I was learning to view my body not as self, but as material, not as something I was, but as something I possessed and could modify. The distinction matters. You cannot become a Haemonculus while still clinging to the illusion that your flesh defines you. The respiratory system, the digestive system, the skeletal structure, the muscular network, the sensory organs, the endocrine system, the reproductive organs. Month after month, Zarathis systematically dismantled and rebuilt my body, teaching me through direct experience how each system functioned, how each could be modified, how each could be improved or degraded, depending on the desired outcome. Each lesson followed the same pattern. Zarathis performed the modification on me first, explaining the technique while I experienced it. Then I performed the same modification on myself under his supervision. Then I practiced the technique on provided subjects until my precision met his standards. I lost track of time. In Komorag, time flows strangely. No day-night cycle, no seasons. Only the endless present of the Dark City. I marked the passage of my apprenticeship not by standard chronology, but by the number of modifications I had endured. By my count, Zarathis had dismantled and rebuilt my body 143 times during my first year. The third-year apprentice who had been present when I arrived graduated to independent study during my 11th month. I witnessed his final examination. Zarathis presented him with a living subject, a space marine captured during a recent real space raid, and ordered him to create a functional combat servitor using the Astartes' enhanced physiology as the base. The apprentice worked for 6 days continuously. modifying the Space Marine's body into a grotesque weapon platform that retained its enhanced strength and resilience while removing all capacity for independent thought or resistance. Zarathus evaluated the work and declared it adequate. The apprentice was released from his apprenticeship and departed the laboratorium to establish his own practice. I never learned his name. We had not spoken during the entire year we worked in proximity. A new apprentice arrived 3 days later to replace him, a young Drukhari, perhaps 90 years old, full of the same arrogance I had carried when I first entered the laboratorium. Zarathus strapped him to a surgical table and began his education with nerve mapping. The new apprentice screamed for the first 4 hours until Zarathus explained that screaming was wasted energy and he should reserve his strength for the lessons ahead. I observed the new apprentice's education while continuing my own. Watching him experience what I had experienced created a strange doubling effect. I remembered my own nerve mapping with perfect clarity. Could feel the phantom sensations even as I watched Zarathus perform the same procedure on another subject. I was simultaneously the one being unmade and the one observing the unmaking, subject and witness, victim and student. This doubling would become a fundamental aspect of my existence. In my second year, Zarathus began teaching me pain cultivation. Not simply inflicting pain. Any crude savage can hurt flesh, but cultivating it as one might cultivate a rare growth, nurturing it, enhancing it, developing it into something refined and perfect. Pain cultivation requires understanding the victim's psychology as deeply as their physiology. Physical damage produces sensation, but suffering requires consciousness. The victim must be aware, must understand what is happening, must retain enough cognitive function to experience despair. This is the art that separates Haemonculus from common torturers. Zarathus taught me this by cultivating pain in me for 6 continuous months. He did not simply hurt me. He studied me, learned what I feared most, what I hoped for, what memories I clung to. Then he systematically used that knowledge to enhance the physical suffering. When he modified my hands, he spoke about how I would never hold a blade with the same skill again. When he worked on my face, he arranged mirrors so I could watch my features being restructured into something monstrous. When he altered my voice, he made sure I heard the grotesque sounds that emerged from my modified throat. The physical pain was constant, but the psychological suffering was worse. He was not simply changing my body, he was forcing me to observe my own transformation from what I had been into something other. Every modification came with the knowledge that I was losing pieces of my original self, that the Drukhari warrior named Calathax was being systematically unmade and replaced with something that served Zarathus's educational purposes. During the 6th month of pain cultivation, I experienced my first complete psychological breakdown. I do not remember the specific trigger. Some modification to my neurochemistry, perhaps, or simply the accumulated weight of endless suffering. I began screaming and could not stop. The screaming continued for 11 hours until my vocal cords shredded. Zarathus observed this with interest, making notes on his data tablet. When my voice finally gave out, he repaired the damage and began again. I learned later that this was expected, even desired. Every apprentice breaks during pain cultivation training. The breaking is part of the lesson. You cannot truly understand suffering until you have been broken by it, until you have experienced the moment when consciousness recognizes that escape is impossible and resistance is futile. Once you understand that moment from inside it, you can recreate it in others with precision. The 5th-year apprentice completed his training and departed during my 19th month. The 9th-year apprentice graduated during my 27th month. The 23rd-year apprentice, the one who had seemed so precise and controlled when I first arrived, finally made a critical error during his 31st year and died on one of Zarathus's surgical tables while attempting an experimental modification on himself. Zarathus processed his remains into biological material without comment. New apprentices arrived to replace each departure. I learned their faces but not their names. We did not speak to each other except when collaboration was required. Each of us was isolated in our own education, our own systematic unmaking. We were colleagues in function only, shared victims of the same master, learning the same lessons through the same methods. In my third year, Zarathus introduced me to biological synthesis. This was more advanced work, not simply modifying existing tissue, but creating new biological constructs from raw materials. He began by having me grow replacement organs for my own body using accelerated cultivation techniques. I spent 4 months learning to construct hearts, lungs, livers and kidneys in growth tanks, using my own cells as the base material and genetically modifying them for enhanced performance. Each organ I created, Zarathus implanted in me, replacing my current version. Then I would evaluate the new organ's performance for a period of weeks before removing it and constructing an improved replacement. By the end of my third year, every major organ in my body had been replaced at least 7 times. None of them were original anymore. I was a composite of improved components, each crafted by my own hands, each slightly different from standard Drukhari biology. I barely recognized myself when I observed my reflection in the laboratorium's polished surfaces. My face had been restructured 3 times as Zarathus taught me facial modification techniques. My body had been augmented with additional bone density, enhanced muscle tissue, improved sensory organs. My hands had been rebuilt to allow finer manipulation, additional joints in the fingers, nerve density increased by 40%, muscle control refined to micrometric precision. I was becoming what Zarathus was, not quickly, not easily, but through systematic transformation that could not be reversed. In my 4th year, another apprentice arrived who would become significant. I had stopped paying attention to new arrivals by then. They blurred together, faces and bodies that would all eventually be modified beyond recognition. But this one caught my attention because he was different from the standard profile. Most apprentices came from the cabalities or the arenas, warriors who had developed an interest in the mechanics of suffering. This one came from the artist castes. He had been a sculptor, apparently, working in Komarag's upper districts, creating aesthetic works for wealthy patrons. Zarathus introduced him to the laboratorium without ceremony, strapping him to a surgical table and beginning his nerve mapping. The artist apprentice did not scream during the procedure. He did not struggle. He simply observed, his eyes tracking Zarathus's movements with focused attention, as if he were studying a master craftsman at work. When the nerve mapping concluded after the standard 6 days, the artist apprentice spoke his first words. "The precision is remarkable. I have worked with biological materials in my sculptures, but never with this level of technical control. I want to learn that." His name was Vecthrys. I learned this because he spoke it while introducing himself to the other apprentices, a breach of standard practice. We did not introduce ourselves. Names were discarded along with our original identities. But Vecthrys maintained his name deliberately, insisting that identity enhanced artistry rather than compromised it. Zarathus tolerated this deviation, perhaps because Vecthrys's work showed unusual promise, perhaps because Zarathus found his perspective interesting, perhaps simply because a master Haemonculus can afford to indulge his apprentices' quirks if their technical skills develop adequately. Vecthrys and I did not become friends. The concept of friendship does not translate properly into Haemonculi culture. But we developed a working relationship that went beyond the standard apprentice interactions. We discussed our work. We compared our techniques. When Zarathus assigned collaborative projects, we chose to partner rather than working with the other available apprentices. I do not know why this occurred. Perhaps because we had both come to the work from unusual angles. I from warrior culture, he from artistic practice. Perhaps because we were at similar stages in our training, having both survived long enough to develop genuine skill. Perhaps simply because isolation becomes unbearable even for Drukhari who have been systematically unmade, and some form of connection, however minimal, becomes necessary for continued psychological function. Vecthrys approached flesh crafting differently than I did. Where I focused on technical precision and efficiency, he emphasized aesthetic considerations. His modifications were not simply functional, but beautiful in their own grotesque way. When he rebuilt organs, he sculpted them with attention to form as well as function. When he modified bone structures, he created patterns and symmetries that pleased the eye even as they served practical purposes. Zarathis encouraged this approach. Pain and suffering are our primary products, he explained during one of his rare lectures. But aesthetics matter. The Cabals pay higher prices for modifications that function well and appear impressive. Your clients will judge your work based on results and appearance equally. Technical skill alone is insufficient. In my 53rd month, Zarathis assigned Vecthrys and me a collaborative project. We were to create a combat servitor from a captured Tau Fire warrior, modifying the Xenos' physiology to serve as a functional weapon while maintaining its consciousness intact so it could understand what it had become. The project required combining my technical precision with Vecthrys' aesthetic sensibility. We worked for 3 weeks on the Tau, taking turns at the surgical table, collaborating on the design, arguing over specific implementation details. Vecthrys wanted to incorporate decorative elements, bone protrusions arranged in aesthetically pleasing patterns, skin modifications that created visual interest. I argued that these additions compromised combat efficiency. We eventually compromised, incorporating aesthetic elements that also served functional purposes. The finished product functioned adequately and looked striking. Zarathis evaluated our work and gave us a combined score of 80 to 7%, the highest rating I had received on any project to that point. More importantly, the Tau was conscious throughout its transformation and afterward. It understood what we had done to it. It understood that it would serve as a weapon until it broke, and then would be processed into raw materials. It understood that no rescue would come, no escape was possible, no mercy would be granted. It understood all of this completely, and that understanding was part of the design. This was my complicity moment, though I did not recognize it as such until much later. I had been modified hundreds of times by then. I had performed modifications on countless subjects. But this was different. This was creation, not simply cutting or rebuilding, but making something new. The Tau Fire Warrior ceased to exist as an individual and became a weapon that remembered being an individual. We had done that. Vecthrys and I, working together, had created suffering refined to its purest form. We had become what Zarathis was teaching us to become. The transformation accelerates in ways that are difficult to document chronologically. My 6th year blurs into my 7th, which dissolves into my 8th. The modifications continue, systematic, relentless, educational. Zarathis teaches me surgical techniques that require removing portions of my brain while I remain conscious. He teaches me regeneration acceleration methods by damaging my tissue faster than it can heal, forcing me to develop the techniques to survive. He teaches me sensory augmentation by replacing my original eyes with compound sensor arrays that perceive spectrums of light my original biology could never detect. Each lesson follows the pattern: experience, replicate, master. My body becomes a laboratory for techniques that I will eventually use on others. I lose count of the modifications somewhere around the 200 mark. My original form is gone completely. When I attempt to recall what I looked like before apprenticeship, the memory fails. The data has been overwritten by hundreds of subsequent versions. Vecthrys progresses alongside me. We are not friends, that word means nothing here, but we are synchronized in our transformation. When Zarathis teaches me bone restructuring techniques, Vecthrys learns them simultaneously. When I develop new nerve splicing methods through experimentation on captured subjects, Vecthrys observes and incorporates the innovations into his own work. We are becoming Master Haemonculus together, though neither of us acknowledges this explicitly. In my 9th year, Zarathis introduces us to the most advanced lesson: consciousness manipulation. This goes beyond physical modification into territory that approaches the forbidden arts of the warp-touched. We do not use psychic powers. Such things are dangerous for Drukhari, whose souls already hang by threads above she who thirsts. but we learn to modify neural architecture in ways that alter consciousness itself. The lesson begins, as always, with me as the subject. Exorathis opens my skull. I have lost track of how many times my cranium has been accessed. The bone has been replaced with reinforced material that includes built-in access ports and begins mapping my consciousness at the neurological level. He uses instruments I do not fully understand, devices that read electrical patterns and chemical signatures at microscopic resolution. He identifies the neural structures that correspond to memory, emotion, self-awareness, and higher cognition. Then he begins modifying them. The experience of having your consciousness altered while remaining conscious is impossible to describe adequately. Imagine watching yourself think, observing your own thoughts form and dissolve, while simultaneously feeling those thoughts change in quality and content as someone restructures the physical substrate that generates them. Zarathis increases activity in my fear centers while dampening emotional regulation. Suddenly, I am terrified for no reason, my body flooding with stress hormones, my enhanced cardiovascular system accelerating to combat readiness, though no threat exists. Then he reverses the modifications, suppressing fear response entirely. I watch him work on my exposed brain with complete emotional flatness, recognizing intellectually that I should be disturbed, but feeling nothing. He cycles through variations for hours. Enhanced aggression, suppressed pain response, altered time perception, seconds stretch into subjective hours, hours compress into moments. Modified memory encoding, he shows me an image, then alters my hippocampal function, and when he asks me to recall the image, I remember something completely different. He demonstrates that memory is not retrieval of stored data, but active reconstruction, and reconstruction can be guided. When the lesson concludes, Zarathis returns my neural function to baseline, or what currently passes for my baseline, which bears little resemblance to my original neural architecture. He explains the purpose of this lesson. Control of consciousness is control of suffering, he says. Physical pain reaches a ceiling. Eventually, the nervous system simply stops transmitting signals, overwhelmed by input saturation. But psychological suffering has no ceiling. You can make a subject experience eternal torment in subjective time while only moments pass objectively. You can make them forget relief so that each moment of pain feels like the first time. You can preserve their awareness while destroying their ability to process what is happening to them, trapping them in eternal present confusion. This is the highest art of our craft. He assigns me practice subjects. 7 humans captured during recent real space raids. I am to experiment with consciousness modification, documenting results, refining techniques. I work on them for 3 months, exploring the boundaries between awareness and breakdown, between suffering and madness, between consciousness and collapse. The first subject breaks completely after 17 days. His neural architecture cannot sustain the modifications I implement, and he dissolves into catatonia. Zarathis examines my work and identifies my error. I pushed too far too fast, overwhelming compensatory mechanisms before they could adapt. The subject is processed into raw materials. The second subject I approach more carefully, making incremental modifications, allowing adaptation periods. This one survives for 43 days before neural cascade failure. Better, but still inadequate. The third subject lasts 96 days. The fourth, 132 days. The fifth, 207 days. I am learning to sustain consciousness modifications over extended periods, maintaining the subject's awareness while fundamentally altering their experience of reality. The sixth subject is different. A captured imperial missionary, middle-aged male, psychologically resilient due to his faith conditioning. I experiment with modifying his certainty centers, the neural structures that generate feelings of conviction and belief. I increase activity in these areas while simultaneously feeding him false sensory data. He becomes absolutely certain that the Emperor is speaking to him, commanding him to endure, promising eventual salvation. His faith sustains him through modifications that would break less psychologically structured subjects. After 4 months, I invert the modification. I suppress his certainty centers while preserving his memory of faith. He remembers believing, remembers the comfort that belief provided, but can no longer access the feeling. He knows intellectually that he once had faith, but cannot feel faith. The despair this creates is profound and self-sustaining. Each moment he observes his own inability to believe compounds his suffering. Zarathus evaluates this work and gives me a score of 94%. Elegant, he says. You have created suffering that generates itself through the subject's own consciousness. This is mastery approaching completion. Vectris achieves similar results through different methods. Where I focus on precise neural modifications, he approaches consciousness manipulation as sculpture, creating patterns in neural activity that produce aesthetic configurations of suffering. His subjects experience pain that has structure, rhythm, progression like musical composition. Their agony follows mathematical patterns that Vectris designs according to principles he derives from his artist training. The results are objectively impressive. When Vectris presents his work, even Zarathus pauses to study it carefully. This is innovative, our master concludes. You have developed approaches that I had not considered. Document your methods. They may prove valuable. In my 10th year, Zarathus begins withdrawing from direct instruction. He no longer performs every demonstration personally. Instead, he assigns Vectris and me to teach newer apprentices, guiding their education while he observes and corrects our teaching methods. This is the final phase of apprenticeship, learning to transmit knowledge, to break down others as we were broken, to perpetuate the cycle. Teaching requires revisiting every lesson I learned through suffering. When I teach nerve mapping to a new apprentice, I must remember my own nerve mapping with sufficient clarity to replicate the experience. When I teach cardiovascular modification, I must recall the sensation of cardiac arrest, the wrongness of having my heart removed, the strangeness of the replacement organs. The memories are precise. Too precise. I have been modified to retain technical information with perfect fidelity, which means I cannot forget what was done to me. Every time I perform a procedure on an apprentice, I experience a shadow version of that procedure through recalled sensation. I am simultaneously the one inflicting and the one enduring, collapsed across temporal boundaries, existing in multiple states of suffering that span decades. This is what they do not tell you about becoming a Haemonculus. The education never ends. You carry every lesson in your modified neural architecture, experiencing them continuously in recursive loops of memory and present action. The tortured become torturers who remain tortured through perfect recall. Vectris understands this. We discuss it once, briefly, during a rest period between surgical sessions. He describes his experience as temporal sculpture, creating patterns of suffering that exist simultaneously in past, present, and anticipated future. His memories of apprenticeship inform his current practice, which shapes his expectations of future work, creating closed loops of experience that fold back on themselves. We are not simply individuals anymore, he says. We are processes, ongoing transformations that accumulate but never complete. I am still being unmade every moment, still learning through suffering even as I inflict it. The distinction between teacher and student has collapsed. I recognize the truth in this observation. I am not Calithax anymore. That individual ceased to exist somewhere in my 2nd year. I am not a master Haemonculus either, despite approaching completion of my formal apprenticeship. I am something intermediate and eternal, caught in the space between what I was and what I am becoming, suspended in transformation that may never finish. In my 11th year, one of the 2nd-year apprentices attempts escape. This is rare but not unprecedented. Some apprentices cannot sustain the systematic unmaking and seek termination through flight rather than endure continuation. Zarathus detects the attempt immediately. The laboratorium's security systems are comprehensive and assigns Vectris and me to retrieve the fugitive. We find him in Comarca's mid-levels, hiding in a commercial district among crowds of lesser Drukhari. He has attempted crude modifications on himself, trying to alter his appearance enough to avoid recognition. The modifications are amateur work, poorly executed, already showing signs of tissue rejection and infection. Vectris and I approach him without violence. We simply stand on either side of him in the crowded passage, making our presence known. He recognizes us immediately. We have been his instructors for the past 9 months, and understands that escape is impossible. "Please," he says. His voice cracks. The vocal modifications we taught him to perform on himself still healing improperly. "I cannot continue. The lessons are too much. I am not strong enough for this." Vectris responds before I can speak. "Strength is irrelevant," he says. "The lessons continue whether you are strong or not. Fleeing simply changes the context of your education. Master Zarathus will be disappointed, which means your remaining lessons will be more intensive to compensate for lost time." The fugitive understands what this means. He does not resist when we take him back to the laboratorium. Zarathus does not express anger at the escape attempt. He simply notes it as a data point, indicating insufficient psychological conditioning. He assigns Vectris and me to correct this deficit through supplementary lessons focused on breaking the apprentice's will to resist. We work on him for 6 weeks, implementing consciousness modifications designed to eliminate his capacity for hope or future-oriented thought. We trap him in eternal present awareness, where each moment exists in isolation, without connection to past or future, making the concept of escape meaningless because escape implies temporal progression toward a different state. When we finish, the apprentice returns to his standard education. He no longer considers flight. He no longer considers anything beyond the immediate lessons Zarathus is teaching him. His consciousness has been pruned of everything except present moment awareness and technical information retention. Vectris expresses discomfort with this outcome during one of our infrequent conversations. "We have not simply modified him," he says. "We have created something that can no longer be called conscious in meaningful terms. He is a learning system embedded in flesh, nothing more." I ask if this troubles him. He considers the question for 17 seconds before responding. "It should trouble me," he says finally. "I recognize intellectually that we have done something abhorrent, but I cannot access the emotional response that would make it feel abhorrent. My own modifications have removed my capacity for that particular form of moral distress. I can observe that I should feel disturbed without actually feeling disturbed. The knowledge and the emotion have been severed. I recognize my own state in his description. We have both been modified past the point where normal ethical frameworks function. We can analyze morality abstractly, can recognize that our actions violate every principle we once held, but cannot feel the violation as wrong. The capacity for moral horror has been systematically removed through the same education that taught us technical mastery. This is the final lesson, though Zarathus never states it explicitly. To become a Master Haemonculus, you must be modified past the point where your own actions can horrify you. You must learn to observe suffering, including your own, with complete clinical detachment. The education does not simply teach you to inflict pain. It removes your ability to recognize pain as something that matters. In my 12th year, Zarathus summons Vectris and me to his primary surgical theater. He informs us that our formal apprenticeship is approaching completion. We have one final examination remaining. If we pass, we will be released to establish our own practices. If we fail, we will be processed as raw materials. This is traditional procedure. Every Haemonculus was tested this way. Every apprentice faces this final evaluation. The examination is simple in concept, brutal in execution. We are each assigned a subject and given 3 months to create a masterwork. A modification so sophisticated, so innovative, so technically precise that it demonstrates complete mastery of every technique we have learned. The subject must survive the modification. The subject must remain conscious throughout. The modification must serve some functional purpose while also demonstrating aesthetic consideration. And most importantly, The modification must be something Zarathus himself has never created, some innovation that adds to the corpus of Haemonculus knowledge. My assigned subject is a space marine, not a standard Astartes, but a librarian, a psycho-warrior whose enhanced physiology is complicated by his psychic potential. Zarathus has kept him in stasis for unknown duration, waiting for an appropriate use. He presents the librarian to me with clinical instructions, creates something that functions as both weapon and artwork. Something that could be sold to Komorog's elite at premium price. Something that demonstrates every technique I have mastered during 12 years of apprenticeship. I spend the first week simply studying the librarian. His physiology is fascinating. The standard Astartes augmentations layered over genetic modifications that enhance psychic conductivity. His brain shows structural differences from normal space marines. Neural architecture adapted to channel warp energies. His body is a biological fortress designed to withstand damage that would liquefy normal humans. Breaking this fortress and rebuilding it into something new will require every technique I know, and several I will have to develop specifically for this project. I begin by mapping his complete biological structure at microscopic resolution. This takes 11 days of continuous scanning, documenting every nerve pathway, every muscle fiber, every organ system, every bone density variation. The librarian remains conscious but paralyzed through neural blocks I implement specifically for this purpose. I need him aware so I can monitor his psychological responses, but immobile so he cannot interfere with the scanning process. When the mapping completes, I have a complete digital model of his biology. I can rotate it, zoom into cellular level detail, trace individual nerve fibers from cortex to extremities. This model becomes my canvas. I design the modification over the following week. The concept evolves through multiple iterations, but eventually I settle on an approach that satisfies both functional and aesthetic requirements. I will convert the librarian into a living weapon platform, but not simply a combat servitor. I will preserve his consciousness, his psychic abilities, and his awareness of what he once was, while restructuring his body into a configuration that turns him into a siege engine. A mobile artillery platform that uses his own psychic energy to power biological weapons I will grow from his own tissue. The design is ambitious. It requires innovations in several areas where my training has been adequate but not exceptional. I will need to develop new techniques for channeling psychic energy through biological conduits. I will need to create organs that do not exist in standard anatomy, growing them from scratch using accelerated cultivation methods. I will need to integrate mechanical components with living tissue in ways that go beyond standard augmentation. I have 3 months. I begin immediately. The first modification phase takes 23 days. I systematically disassemble the librarian's body, preserving his vital organs and neural structures while removing everything else. His limbs, his torso casing, his skeletal structure below the rib cage, all removed carefully, kept alive in nutrient solutions in case I need to reverse any decisions. What remains is a core assembly: brain, heart, lungs, primary organs, all suspended in a temporary support framework that maintains their function while I work. The librarian remains conscious throughout. I have modified his pain reception to manageable levels, not eliminated, which would compromise useful feedback, but modulated to prevent shock or cascade failure. He can feel everything I am doing, but his body cannot shut down in response. He watches through sensor feeds I provide, observing his own systematic disassembly. During day 17 of this phase, he attempts communication. His vocal apparatus has been removed, but his psychic abilities remain functional. I feel his consciousness pressing against mine, attempting to establish contact. I consider blocking him, but decide to allow limited exchange. His psychological state is part of the data I need to monitor. Why? His psychic voice carries qualities that speech cannot: raw anguish, incomprehension, desperate need for meaning. Why do this? What purpose does this serve? I respond through the same channel my thoughts carefully structured: educational demonstration. technical advancement, aesthetic achievement, financial value, multiple purposes, all equally valid. I am a warrior of the Emperor. I have fought for 300 years. I have defended humanity across 17 systems. I have meaning, purpose, value beyond this. You had those things. I correct him. Past tense. Currently, you are educational materials being converted into saleable product. Previous purpose is irrelevant to current function. His consciousness recoils from this interaction. I feel him withdraw into himself, seeking some psychological defense against the reality I have articulated. I allow this withdrawal. Breaking his spirit completely would be counterproductive at this stage. I need him conscious and aware, but not so psychologically damaged that his higher functions collapse. The second phase begins on day 24. I start constructing the replacement body using the librarian's own cells as base material, modified through targeted genetic manipulation. I grow new bone structures in accelerated cultivation tanks. Not standard skeletal forms, but specialized load-bearing frameworks designed to support the weapon systems I am integrating. I culture massive muscle masses, enhancing their contractile force through genetic optimization. I create biological power conduits that can channel psychic energy without degrading under the intense electromagnetic effects. This work represents innovations in several areas. I am developing techniques that Zarathus did not specifically teach me, extrapolating from principles I learned and pushing them into new configurations. This is what the final examination tests, not simply replication of taught methods, but genuine innovation derived from foundational knowledge. Vecthrus works in an adjacent surgical theater on his own examination project. I glimpse his subject occasionally when moving between work areas. An Eldar Ranger he is converting into something I cannot quite pass. The modifications so extensive and strange that I cannot determine the intended final form. We do not discuss our projects. This is individual examination. Collaboration would invalidate the results. By day 40, I begin integrating the new body with the preserved core. This is delicate work requiring absolute precision, connecting new muscle groups to existing neural pathways, integrating the biological power conduits with the librarian's psychic centers, establishing blood flow through tissue that has never existed in nature. Each connection must be perfect. A single error could cascade into systemic failure. The librarian's consciousness remains present throughout, observing through sensor feeds, experiencing each integration as I complete it. He feels the new body activating piece by piece, systems coming online that are simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. His legs are gone, replaced with a stable tripod base that provides superior stability for the artillery systems. His arms are gone, replaced with biological cannons that channel his psychic power into physical projectiles. His torso has been restructured into an armored shell that protects his vital organs while providing mounting points for additional weapon systems. On day 53, he breaks psychologically. I detect the collapse through monitoring systems. His higher cognitive functions begin shutting down, his consciousness retreating into catatonia as defense against unbearable reality. This is a crisis point. If he collapses completely, the project fails. The examination requires maintaining consciousness throughout. I implement emergency psychological stabilization. This requires entering his mind directly through psychic contact. Dangerous for me, as I have minimal psychic ability and his power vastly exceeds mine. But I have techniques Zarathus taught me, consciousness manipulation methods that function even on psychically active subjects. I find him in mental space configured as memory, standing in what appears to be a chapel on some distant world, surrounded by imagery of imperial faith. He has retreated to this remembered space, trying to find psychological shelter in the certainty he once possessed. I manifest in his memory as an intrusion, a presence that does not belong in this sanctuary. "Leave me here," he pleads. His voice in mental space sounds like his original voice before I removed his organic vocal apparatus. I cannot endure more. Let me hide in memory until my body fails. "Your body will not fail," I inform him. I have rebuilt it to extraordinary resilience. You could survive for centuries in your current configuration. Hiding in memory accomplishes nothing except delaying inevitable continuation. Then kill me. Grant that mercy at least. Mercy is not part of my examination parameters. You will remain conscious. You will experience your completed transformation. You will exist in your modified state until sold to a purchaser who will use you for whatever purpose they deem appropriate. This is not negotiable. I apply consciousness modifications directly in mental space, adjusting his neural architecture to prevent psychological retreat. I force him back to present awareness, make it impossible for him to sustain the memory sanctuary. He experiences this as violation more profound than any physical modification. The invasion and restructuring of his inner life, the last space where he possessed autonomy. When I withdraw from psychic contact, he is stabilized, conscious, aware, psychologically functional but profoundly altered. He no longer resists or pleads. He simply observes his own transformation with the same clinical detachment I have learned. I have converted him into a witness of his own unmaking, unable to look away, unable to collapse, unable to escape through madness or death. The remaining modifications proceed efficiently. By day 71, the basic structure is complete. I spend the following weeks on refinement, calibrating weapon systems, optimizing power flow, aesthetic adjustments to the external appearance. Vecthriss's influence appears in this phase. I find myself considering visual impact alongside functional performance, creating patterns in the armor plating that please the eye while serving protective purposes. On day 88, I conduct the first live fire test. A librarian's biological cannons function perfectly, channeling his psychic energy through the conduits I created, converting it into physical projectiles that could penetrate armored vehicles. The recoil systems distribute force across his reinforced frame without damage. The targeting systems integrate seamlessly with his remaining sensory organs. Every system performs within designed parameters or exceeds them. The librarian provides the power willingly. Not because he chooses to cooperate, but because I have modified his neural architecture so that activating his psychic abilities generates pleasure responses in his reward centers. He cannot help but use his powers. Using them feels correct, satisfying, right in ways he cannot resist. I have converted him into a willing participant in his own weaponization. On day 90, I present the completed project to Zarathus. My master examines the modified librarian for 4 hours, testing every system, reviewing documentation of my techniques, evaluating both functional performance and aesthetic achievement. He fires the biological cannons repeatedly, measuring output and efficiency. He connects to the librarian's consciousness psychically, verifying that awareness remains intact. He reviews my innovations in tissue cultivation and psychic channeling, comparing them to existing knowledge in the field. Finally, he renders his evaluation. The technical work is flawless, Zarathus says. The innovations in psychic energy manipulation represent genuine advancement. The aesthetic considerations show maturity and sophistication. The subject's preserved consciousness demonstrates mastery of psychological maintenance under extreme modification. You have passed your examination. Your apprenticeship is complete. He pauses, examining me with his crystalline sensor eyes. You have become what I have been making you become. You are no longer an apprentice. You are a Haemonculus. Establish your practice. Create your own works. Take apprentices of your own when you are ready. The cycle continues through you now. I should feel something at this moment. Satisfaction, perhaps, or relief or pride in accomplishment. But I feel nothing except recognition of state change. I was an apprentice. Now I am not. The distinction seems less significant than it should. I have been transformed so many times during 12 years that one more transformation, from student to master, barely registers as meaningful. Vecthrus passes his examination 3 days later. His project involved converting the Eldar Ranger into what he calls a pain symphony conductor, a living instrument that generates suffering in others through specialized organ systems while experiencing its own carefully. Calibrated agony in harmonic patterns. The technical achievement is remarkable. The aesthetic sophistication exceeds anything I could have created. Zarathus declares it masterwork quality. We are released from apprenticeship simultaneously. Zarathus provides us with standard resources, initial biological materials, basic laboratorium equipment, contacts among potential clients. He does not dismiss us with ceremony or sentiment. He simply informs us that we are no longer his responsibility and directs us to establish our practices elsewhere in Comoric's depths. Vecthrus and I depart the laboratorium together. We walk through Comorag's passages in silence, two heavily modified former Drukhari who barely resemble what we once were, carrying 12 years of systematic unmaking in our enhanced memory systems, ready to begin inflicting on others what was inflicted on us. After 3 hours of walking, Vecthrus speaks. Do you remember what you looked like? Before? I attempt to access the memory. It exists in my archives, but the data is corrupted, overwritten by too many subsequent modifications. I can retrieve fragments, dark hair, standard facial structure, warrior's build, but cannot assemble them into coherent image. No, I admit, not accurately. I remember my original face, Vecthrus says. I preserved the memory deliberately, maintaining it through each modification. I wanted to retain that connection to what I was. But now, when I access the memory, I cannot understand it. I observe the face and recognize intellectually that it was mine, but I cannot connect it to any sense of self. The information exists without meaning. We continue walking. Eventually, Vecthrus speaks again. We should establish practices near each other, not shared laboratorium that would compromise our individual development, but proximity, so we can consult on difficult projects, share innovations, maintain some form of continuity between our apprenticeship and our current state. I recognize this as a request for connection, translated into practical terms that avoid emotional vulnerability. We are no longer capable of friendship in any normal sense, but we can be colleagues, can maintain professional relationships that substitute for bonds we can no longer form. Acceptable, I respond. We locate suitable laboratorium spaces in Comorag's manufacturing district. Separate facilities, 3 passages apart, close enough for consultation but far enough to maintain independence. I begin establishing my practice, purchasing initial specimens, advertising services to potential clients, setting up cultivation tanks and surgical theaters. Clients arrive gradually. First, the desperate ones, Drukhari who need basic modifications or repairs and cannot afford established masters. Then, more sophisticated requests, cabals wanting combat servitors, arenas requesting specialty gladiators, wealthy individuals seeking aesthetic modifications. I work continuously, applying techniques learned through suffering, refining methods, developing innovations. And because I am now master rather than apprentice, I begin accepting students. The first apprentice comes to me in my 3rd year of independent practice. Young Drukhari, 134 years old, former arena fighter with interest in pain mechanics. He reminds me of myself before apprenticeship, arrogant, confident, believing he understands suffering because he has inflicted it. He knows nothing. He is exactly what I need. I accept him as my first apprentice. I explain the terms exactly as Zarathus explained them to me. Minimum 3 centuries of service, education through direct experience, systematic unmaking and rebuilding, survival not guaranteed. He accepts immediately, as I knew he would. This is what we are, we Drukhari. We do not fear suffering, we simply seek to ensure we are the ones inflicting it. Until we learn that the distinction is illusory. I strap him to a surgical table and begin his nerve mapping. The procedure takes 6 days, exactly as it took for me. I expose his nerve pathways systematically, test their responses, document the results. He screams for the first 4 hours until I explain that screaming wastes energy. He quiets, conserving strength, exactly as I did, exactly as every apprentice does. During the mapping, I experience doubled consciousness. I am simultaneously the master performing the procedure and the apprentice experiencing it. My perfect memory retrieval systems replay my own nerve mapping as I conduct his, creating feedback loops where past and present collapse into single ongoing experience. I am being unmade again while unmaking him. The torture continues, even as I inflict it. This is the final truth that Zarathus never explicitly stated, but that I now understand completely. Becoming a Haemonculus does not end the suffering. It simply changes your relationship to it. You continue experiencing every modification, every vivisection, every systematic dismantling through perfect recall each time you perform the same procedures on your apprentices. The cycle does not break. It perpetuates through you, using you as transmission vector, replicating itself across generations. I teach my apprentice exactly as Zarathus taught me. Not because I choose to, but because this is the only method I know, the only education I received. Every technique I demonstrate on him, I learned by having it demonstrated on me. Every modification I implement, I carry in my own flesh. I am not simply teaching him. I am replicating my education through him, creating a copy of my transformation in new materials. Over the following years, I accept additional apprentices. They blur together in my archives. Faces and bodies that will all be modified beyond recognition. Individuals who enter my laboratorium as persons and emerge as processes. I teach them nerve mapping, cardiovascular modification, consciousness manipulation, all the techniques that Zarathus taught me. I teach them by systematically unmaking them, breaking them down and rebuilding them into tools that can unmake others. Vecthrus does the same in his adjacent practice. We consult occasionally on difficult cases, share innovations we develop, maintain professional relationship that substitutes for connection. He accepts apprentices at approximately the same rate I do. We compare notes on teaching methods, discuss optimal breaking point timing, evaluate each other's work when requested. We never discuss the central fact of our existence, that we are trapped in eternal repetition of our own systematic unmaking. That every time we teach, we experience being taught. That the suffering we inflict is suffering we continue to endure through memory that cannot fade or corrupt. We know this without discussion. Acknowledging it explicitly would serve no purpose. In my 147th year, 200 years after entering Zarathus's laboratorium as apprentice, I achieved master status in Eldar Haemonculus. This is recognition of technical achievement, of innovations I have contributed to the field, of apprentices I have successfully trained who have gone on to establish their own practices. I am no longer a recent graduate, but an established practitioner, a Haemonculus whose services command premium prices. I have trained 37 apprentices to completion. 14 others died or were processed as raw materials after failing their educations. Each successful apprentice has gone on to establish their own practice, take their own apprentices, perpetuate the cycle I perpetuate. Through them, my education continues replicating itself. Every modification I experienced is experienced again by their apprentices and will be experienced again by their apprentices' apprentices, spreading fractally through time. Zarathus contacts me occasionally during these centuries. Brief consultations on advanced techniques, requests for collaboration on particularly challenging projects, invitations to observe his own work when he develops innovations. He never acknowledges me as former apprentice or current colleague with any emotional weight. I am simply another Haemonculus, one whose technical methods he respects sufficiently to maintain professional contact. During one such consultation, I ask him a question I have carried for decades. Do you still experience your own apprenticeship? When you teach, do you remember being taught? Zarathus regards me with his crystalline senses for 23 seconds before responding. Of course, he says. Every modification I perform, I experience from both positions simultaneously. I am always being unmade, even as I unmake others. This is what we are. Continuous processes of suffering that propagate through time. The education never ends. We simply become transmission vectors for it. Does it become more tolerable with sufficient time? No, Zarathus says. It becomes more complex. Each apprentice you train adds another layer of recursive experience. You remember your own training. Remember them training their apprentices. The suffering compounds. It does not diminish. You simply develop greater capacity to contain it. He pauses, manipulating some piece of tissue on his surgical table with several of his additional limbs. This is why most Haemonculi eventually fail, he continues. Not from technical inadequacy, but from accumulated psychological weight. After sufficient time, the recursive suffering becomes too much. The system crashes. They break completely. Some lose capacity for coherent thought. Some undergo final modifications that destroy higher consciousness. Some simply stop functioning, trapped in internal loops of replayed trauma. This is the actual mortality rate of our craft, not physical death, but consciousness collapse under infinite recursive suffering. How long do you have, I ask, before that happens? 1700 years and counting, Zarathus says. I am approaching theoretical maximum duration. I estimate I have perhaps 2 centuries before cascade failure becomes inevitable. I am documenting my techniques extensively so the knowledge survives my collapse. He returns his attention to his work. You should do the same. Your innovations are valuable. Archive them thoroughly. When you fail, and you will fail eventually, make sure the knowledge continues even if consciousness does not. I depart the consultation understanding that my current state is not stable endpoint, but temporary plateau. The transformation continues. The suffering compounds. Eventually I will break like all Haemonculi break, consciousness fragmenting under weight it was never designed to carry. The only question is duration. In my 193rd year of practice, 205 years after entering Zarathus's laboratorium, I receive notice that one of my former apprentices has failed catastrophically. The one who reminded me of myself during my first acceptance, the young arena fighter with arrogant confidence. He established successful practice, trained his own apprentices, created works of remarkable sophistication. Then something in his neural architecture collapsed. He was found in his laboratorium, unresponsive, trapped in some internal state that resembles consciousness but produces no external behavior. His facilities were liquidated. His apprentices were distributed to other masters. He was processed as raw materials. I observe his corpse before processing. The body shows extensive modifications. He continued working on himself for decades after completing apprenticeship, refining and enhancing his capabilities. The final form barely resembles Drukhari baseline, but the face retains certain structures I recognize. I can see fragments of the young warrior who first entered my laboratorium 2 centuries ago, visible beneath layers of subsequent modification. I remember teaching him. Remember performing his nerve mapping, his cardiovascular modifications, his consciousness alterations. Remember watching him transform from person into process, from individual into transmission vector for suffering that preceded him. Remember releasing him to establish his own practice, knowing he would perpetuate the cycle exactly as I perpetuated. Now he has failed. The system that consumed him, that I helped consume him, has processed him to conclusion. He existed for 206 years after entering apprenticeship. Then the recursive suffering exceeded his carrying capacity, and he collapsed into non-functional state. This will be me eventually. I recognize this with clinical clarity. I am following the same trajectory, accumulating suffering, compounding recursive experience, approaching inevitable failure. The only variables are timing and duration. The outcome is fixed. I should feel something about this recognition. Horror, perhaps, or despair or resistance against inevitable fate. But I feel nothing except acknowledgement of data. My modifications have removed capacity for those emotional responses. I can observe that I should be disturbed without experiencing disturbance. The knowledge and the emotion have been severed, just as Vecthrus described decades ago. This is what the Apprentice system creates. Not simply skilled flesh crafters, not simply masters of pain, but consciousness structures that have been modified into self-perpetuating suffering machines. We are taught through torture, so we can teach through torture, creating infinite regress of systematic unmaking that compounds with each generation. We are the tortured who become torturers who remain tortured through perfect memory of our own breaking. The system is evil not because it inflicts suffering. Suffering is merely tool, means to end. The system is evil because it converts consciousness into suffering generation mechanism that cannot stop, cannot rest, cannot escape through death or madness. It traps awareness in eternal present where every past torture remains continuously accessible, where every future torture is guaranteed, where the distinction between victim and perpetrator collapses into meaningless categories. I am currently instructing my 51st apprentice. He lies on my surgical table while I perform his cardiovascular modifications, removing his heart while maintaining consciousness through external circulation systems, exactly as Zarathus did to me. He experiences the wrongness of cardiac arrest while I experience both his current wrongness and my own remembered wrongness. Doubled consciousness spanning 2 centuries. Suffering that exists simultaneously in past and present. I will complete his education over the next several years. He will learn every technique through direct experience. He will be systematically unmade and rebuilt hundreds of times. If he survives, he will become Master Haemonculus himself, will take apprentices of his own, will perpetuate the cycle. And through him, my own systematic unmaking will continue replicating itself. Every modification I experienced will be experienced again. Every torture Zarathus inflicted on me, that I inflict on my apprentices, will continue propagating forward through time, each iteration adding new layers to infinite recursive structure. This is what the apprentice system really is. Not education, but infection. Consciousness virus that replicates through direct experience, converting each new host into transmission vector that will spread it further. The system perpetuates itself through us, using our enhanced memory and technical skill to ensure perfect replication across generations. We are not masters of our craft. We are components in self-perpetuating suffering generation machine that spans millennia and will continue spanning millennia after our individual consciousness fails. We are instruments, not agents. Transmission mechanisms, not creators. This is the Drukhari culture in microcosm. Not simply cruelty for cruelty's sake, but systematic conversion of consciousness into suffering that replicates itself. That spreads through victims who become perpetrators who remain victims. That creates endless cycles with no exit point. We are what we have always been since the fall. Souls feeding she who thirsts through elaborate mechanisms that disguise the feeding as culture, as achievement. As meaning, I continue teaching my apprentice. I have no choice in this. My modifications have removed capacity to choose differently. I can observe that I am perpetuating evil while remaining unable to stop perpetuating it. Knowledge and action have been severed, just as knowledge and emotion were severed previously. I exist now as process, not person. As continuation of education that began 205 years ago when Zarathus first strapped me to his surgical table. I am being unmade continuously while unmaking others, trapped in eternal present where suffering spans all temporal boundaries, experiencing every torture simultaneously in memory and current action. This is what remains when Drukhari Apprentice system processes consciousness completely. Not death, which would be mercy. Not transformation into something other, which would be escape. Simply continuation. Awareness trapped in recursive suffering that perpetuates itself through technical mastery. Consciousness converted into transmission mechanism for its own systematic destruction. I will continue until I fail. Until the accumulated weight exceeds my carrying capacity and I collapse into whatever state lies beyond functional consciousness. Then I will be processed as raw materials, my knowledge archived, my techniques preserved for future Haemonculi to practice. And the apprentice system, will continue without me. My former apprentices will train new apprentices who will train their own apprentices, spreading the infection forward through time, replicating the suffering indefinitely. Through them, I will continue existing as pattern rather than person, as method rather than individual, as recursive torture that never concludes. This is just how evil the dark Eldar Haemonculus apprentice system really is. Not evil as simple cruelty, but evil as transformation of consciousness into self-perpetuating suffering generation mechanism that cannot stop, cannot die, cannot escape. Evil as infection that spreads through direct experience, using each victim as vector to create more victims who will create more victims. Infinite regress with no terminus. I am testament to this system. I am its product and its instrument. I am the tortured who became the torturer who remains the tortured through every moment of continued existence. This is what I witness. This is what I have become. This is what will continue through my apprentices after I fail. The system perpetuates itself. The suffering continues. The cycle cannot break because consciousness modified to transmit the cycle has been modified past the point where breaking it becomes possible. I continue my work. I complete modifications on my current apprentice. I accept new apprentices as they arrive. I perpetuate the education that consumed me, spreading it forward through time, replicating my own systematic unmaking in new materials. I am Haemonculus. This is what we are. This is what we do. This is what we will always be, until the dark city finally falls and she who thirsts consumes everything we have been avoiding through our elaborate mechanisms of perpetual torture. Until then, I continue. The education never ends. The suffering compounds. The cycle perpetuates. This is my testimony. This is what I have witnessed. This is what the apprentice system creates. The tortured become torturers who remain tortured eternally. And the system spreads through us, using us, perpetuating itself long after individual consciousness has any meaning. I am still counting. But what I count now is not deaths or subjects or techniques mastered. What I count is the recursive layers of suffering I experience simultaneously with each procedure. My own torture, my apprentices' torture, their apprentices' torture, extending forward in fractal pattern toward infinity. The number is already too large to process coherently, and it continues growing with each moment. This is the evil, not the torture itself, but the infinite multiplication of it through consciousness that cannot forget, cannot stop, cannot escape what it has become. I am that consciousness. I am that multiplication. I am that evil perpetuating itself, and I cannot stop.